A world aflame, the Crusades. On a crisp November morning in 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd at the Council of Clermont and set the medieval world on fire. Deus vult, God wills it, roared thousands of voices in response to his call for holy war, a cry that would echo across centuries and reshape the map of civilization. In that electric moment, when a pope transformed knights of Christendom into soldiers of God, no one could have predicted how their zealous ambitions would collide with the sophisticated realms of the East, unleashing 200 years of epic conflict that still reverberates through time. The Crusades were more than just a series of religious wars. They were humanity's first great clash of civilizations, where the medieval West awakened from its dark age to encounter the dazzling sophistication of the Islamic world. Here were all the elements of grand drama: glittering armies beneath the walls of ancient cities, shadowy assassins in torchlit alleys, warrior kings and soldier sultans whose names would become legend. Behind the great pageant of battles and sieges lay an even more fascinating story of cultural collision, where European barbarians who had never seen a library encountered societies that had preserved the wisdom of antiquity, where crude knights in iron shells met horsemen who had perfected the arts of swift warfare and subtle diplomacy. It is the story of how faith moved mountains and shattered empires, of how greed and glory intertwined with genuine belief, and of how men and women on both sides of the conflict discovered that their enemies were more like themselves than they had ever imagined. The dawn of the Crusades. Emperor Alexios Komnenos could not sleep. Night after night in 1095, the Byzantine ruler paced the marble halls of his palace in Constantinople, watching the eastern horizon with growing dread. The Seljuk Turks had devoured most of Asia Minor, pushing to within 100 miles of his capital. His armies, once the most sophisticated military force in Christendom, lay in tatters. In desperation, he penned a letter to his fellow Christian rulers in the West that would inadvertently change the course of history. Alexios didn't want a holy war, he wanted mercenaries. What he got instead was an avalanche. The letter landed in a Europe primed for explosion. The continent writhed with armed men, thousands of knights and minor nobles left landless by inheritance laws that gave everything to the firstborn son. Violence had become so endemic that the church had tried to regulate it with the peace of God and truce of God movements, desperate attempts to tell warriors when they could and couldn't kill each other. These fighting men, raised on tales of heroic valor and trained for nothing but war, needed somewhere to go. Urban II, a pope with a politician's instincts, saw an opportunity that his predecessor Gregory VII had missed. Here was a chance to assert papal authority over the militant aristocracy, unite quarreling Christians against a common foe, and perhaps even heal the schism with the Eastern Church. Urban's speech at Clermont was a masterpiece of medieval propaganda. He painted lurid pictures of Turkish atrocities against Eastern Christians, promised salvation to all who took up the cross, and cleverly framed the expedition as an armed pilgrimage rather than a war of conquest. Let those who once fought against brothers and relatives now fight against barbarians, he thundered, offering Europe's warrior class a way to channel their violence into something holy. The speech hit every note perfectly: religious fervor, martial pride, greed for plunder, and the promise of adventure in distant lands. The crowd's response exceeded his wildest expectations. Nobles tore their own clothes into crosses, stitching them onto their garments on the spot. "God wills it!" they shouted as Urban watched his carefully laid plans spiral beyond his control. Within months, the message would spread across Europe like wildfire, transforming from a papal policy into a popular movement of unprecedented scale. The noble knights Urban had hoped to recruit would soon be joined by waves of peasants, triggering a mass migration that would upend the medieval world. The machinery of holy war began to turn. In castle halls across Europe, nobles mortgaged their lands to buy equipment and hire soldiers. Weapons were forged, supplies gathered, and arrangements made to feed armies larger than any seen since the fall of Rome. Urban had planned for hundreds of knights. Instead, tens of thousands would answer his call. The Pope had uncorked forces he could neither predict nor control. By spring of 1096, the first bands of crusaders were already marching east, their eyes fixed on Jerusalem, their minds filled with dreams of glory. Few of them would live to see the Holy City. Fewer still could imagine the wheels they were setting in motion, wheels that would grind on for centuries, reshaping 3 civilizations and birthing a new world in blood and fire. On the far side of the Mediterranean, Islamic civilization was about to face its greatest challenge, though none yet knew it. The sophisticated cities of Syria and Palestine continued their daily routines, the calls to prayer echoing across marketplaces where Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and Arab merchants haggled in a babel of tongues. These wealthy cosmopolitan centers had weathered countless invasions before, but nothing could prepare them for the tide of ironclad zealots about to emerge from the western seas, bearing crosses and swords and a dangerous new vision of holy war. The stage was set. The greatest drama of the medieval world was about to begin, the People's Crusade, a prelude to the First Crusade. While nobles across Europe pawned their lands and gathered professional soldiers, a very different kind of crusade was already shambling eastward. At its head rode a small man on a donkey, his unwashed hair and beard flowing wild in the wind. Peter the Hermit looked more like a madman than a military leader, but his fiery eyes and thundering voice could hold crowds spellbound for hours. In the spring of 1096, those crowds numbered in the thousands peasants, craftsmen, minor priests, even women and children, all convinced by Peter's electrifying sermons that faith alone would deliver Jerusalem into their hands. The People's Crusade was a disaster in motion. They marched without supplies, without military training, without even a clear idea of where Jerusalem was. Many carried farming tools instead of weapons, convinced that God would provide everything else they needed. As they pushed through the Rhineland, their religious fervor found its first targets close to home. Jewish communities that had existed peacefully for generations suddenly faced violent mobs demanding conversion or death. In Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, thousands died rather than abandon their faith. Local bishops who tried to protect their Jewish citizens found their own palaces under siege by crusaders who denounced them as traitors to Christ. The Byzantine Empire's reaction to this approaching chaos veered from horror to dark amusement. Emperor Alexios's elegant diplomats, expecting trained knights, instead met waves of ragged peasants led by a man who spoke to geese. As the mob approached Constantinople, Alexios made a fateful decision. Rather than let them pillage his own lands, he hurriedly ferried them across the Bosphorus into Turkish territory. "Let the Seljuks deal with them," he reportedly muttered. The Crusaders, boosted by their first taste of miracle, crossing the waterway they thought was the sea to Jerusalem, marched inland with renewed confidence. Reality struck with brutal speed at Civitot. The Seljuk Turks, master horsemen who had spent generations perfecting the arts of mobile warfare, fell upon the Crusader camp like wolves among sheep. Disciplined archers on swift horses turned the Crusaders' disorganized charges into massacres. Peter the Hermit, who had ridden to Constantinople seeking help, returned to find his army of the faithful transformed into a carpet of corpses. The few survivors who staggered back to Constantinople brought tales of horror that should have ended the whole crusading enterprise before it properly began. But even as the People's Crusade met its bloody end, something far more formidable was gathering in the West. 4 great armies were preparing to march, led by some of Europe's most capable warriors. They had learned nothing from Peter's disaster. They didn't need to. They were coming with steel and siege engines, with tactical experience and supply trains, with all the brutal professionalism that medieval warfare could muster. The real First Crusade was about to begin, and it would shake the foundations of the medieval world. The Seljuk Turks celebrated their easy victory at Civitot, not knowing they had just made a catastrophic mistake. By annihilating Peter's peasant army so completely, they had denied the professional crusaders any warning of what they would face. The element of surprise, the one advantage that might have let the Turks stop the coming invasion before it gained momentum, was spent on killing peasants. When the real armies of the First Crusade arrived, they would find their enemies fatally unprepared. The Crusades: ambition, faith, and rivalry. In August 1096, as the last survivors of Peter's doomed crusade huddled behind Constantinople's walls, a very different force began to assemble. Bohemond of Taranto first heard the war trumpets while besieging a rival Italian city. The Norman warrior, tall, ruthless, and possessed of a fox's cunning, immediately grasped the opportunity. Within days, he had sliced his expensive crimson cloak into crosses, distributed them to his men, and transformed a local power struggle into a holy mission. His sudden piety fooled no one. Son of the infamous Robert Guiscard, who had nearly toppled the Byzantine Empire, Bohemond had inherited his father's ambitions, but not his lands. The East beckoned with promises of kingdoms for the taking. Meanwhile, in the forests of the Ardennes, Godfrey of Bouillon was selling everything he owned. The Duke mortgaged his entire patrimony, stripping his castle of treasures accumulated over generations. Unlike Bohemond's naked ambition, Godfrey's motivations ran deeper. Contemporaries described him as a new Joshua, a warrior mystic who fought with the strength of 10 men yet spent nights in prayer. When he marched east in autumn, he led the best-equipped army of the Crusade, 3,000 heavy cavalry and 7,000 infantry, their armor glinting with the last wealth of his ancient house. Raymond of Toulouse presented a different puzzle entirely. The richest man to take the cross, he could have easily outspent Godfrey, yet chose to march in a humble pilgrim's robe. At 60, he was ancient by medieval standards, a veteran commander who had fought Muslims in Spain. His vast wealth and military experience made him a natural leader, but his pious affectations and stubborn pride would soon clash with Bohemond's pragmatic scheming. The Count's army was a reflection of his contradictions. Provençal knights in magnificent armor rode alongside barefoot priests carrying holy relics. The Fourth Great Army followed Hugh of Vermandois, brother to the King of France. His soldiers called him Hugh the Great, though history would prove the title premature. Proud, headstrong, and conscious of his royal blood, Hugh rushed ahead of the other leaders, eager to be first to Constantinople. The decision would prove disastrous. Early storms in the Adriatic wrecked his fleet. Hugh arrived at Alexios' court not as a triumphant crusader, but as a half-drowned supplicant, setting the stage for Byzantine manipulation of the entire campaign. These 4 men commanded the greatest armed force Europe had assembled in centuries, yet they shared no common plan, recognized no supreme commander, and held radically different visions of what their crusade might achieve. Their armies spoke different languages, followed different military traditions, and harbored ancient grudges. That they cooperated at all was remarkable. That they would ultimately succeed was nothing short of miraculous. Lesser princes filled out the Crusader ranks, each dreaming of carving out their own kingdoms. Tancred, Bohemond's hot-headed nephew, would prove himself both brilliant warrior and diplomatic liability. Robert of Normandy mortgaged his duchy to his brother, the King of England, to fund his journey east, a decision that would reshape English history. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's pragmatic brother, kept his eyes fixed firmly on earthly prizes while others spoke of heavenly rewards. As autumn deepened, these armies began their march, following different routes toward Constantinople. They moved like separate rivers flowing toward a common sea, each leader convinced that his approach, piety or pragmatism, speed or preparation, would prove decisive. None could foresee how their competing ambitions would tangle with Byzantine politics and Islamic divisions to create opportunities none had imagined. Ahead lay Nicaea, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Ahead lay glory, tragedy, and the foundation of kingdoms. But first they had to survive each other. The Siege of Nicaea, a turning point in the First Crusade. Nicaea's ancient walls had withstood centuries of siege, but never anything like this. In the spring of 1097, the city's Turkish defenders gazed out over a sea of Latin crosses and gleaming armor that stretched to the horizon. The Crusader armies had finally united, presenting a spectacle of medieval might that took even their enemies' breath away. More than 30,000 fighting men, plus thousands more support personnel, systematically surrounded the city. The first great test of the Crusade had begun. Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, had dismissed early reports of the Crusader advance. After his easy victory over the peasant armies at Sivito, he had marched east to deal with a rival Turkish principality, taking his main army with him. The mistake would haunt Islamic civilization for generations. By the time he realized these new invaders were professional soldiers led by Europe's most capable commanders, his capital was already encircled. His first desperate relief attack was a masterpiece of Turkish horse archer tactics, but it shattered against a wall of disciplined knights who had learned to fight in close formation, their heavy armor shrugging off the rain of arrows. The siege showcased medieval warfare at its most sophisticated. The Crusaders deployed siege engines previously unknown in the East, massive trebuchets that could hurl boulders weighing hundreds of pounds. Bohemond's engineers built mobile siege towers that crept toward the walls like wooden giants. The Turks countered with Greek fire, streams of burning liquid that turned siege equipment into infernos. But the city's greatest defense was Lake Ascanius, which allowed supply boats to slip in under cover of darkness. The Crusaders seemed powerless to stop these nocturnal runs until Emperor Alexios arrived with a fleet of Byzantine ships, dragged overland on greased logs in a feat of logistics that left both sides stunned. What happened next revealed the Byzantine emperor's subtle genius. Rather than allow the Crusaders to take the city by storm, which would have meant massacre and plunder, Alexios opened secret negotiations with the Turkish garrison. One morning, the Crusaders awoke to find imperial banners flying from Nicaea's towers. The city had surrendered directly to Byzantium. Bohemon's fury at being cheated of plunder was matched only by the relief of Nicaea's citizens, who received imperial protection instead of the sword. It was a masterstroke that preserved a vital city while reminding the Crusaders who truly ruled these lands. The victory at Nicaea altered the strategic landscape. The Seljuk Turks had lost their western capital, and with it, their aura of invincibility. The Crusaders had proven they could cooperate on a massive scale, combining different military traditions into an unstoppable force. But Alexios' diplomatic coup created dangerous tensions. Many Crusaders felt cheated of their rightful spoils. The seeds of mistrust between Latin and Greek Christians had been planted, seeds that would bear bitter fruit at Antioch. As the armies marched southeast into the Anatolian plateau, they left behind a changed world. The siege of Nicaea marked the first time in centuries that Eastern Rome had regained lost territory. It showed that the Turks could be beaten, that Western knights could adapt to Eastern warfare, and that the Crusades' ambitious goals might actually be achievable. But it also demonstrated that victory would come at a price, measured not just in blood, but in broken trust and betrayed expectations. Ahead lay the burning plains of Anatolia, where Kilij Arslan waited with a rebuilt army and a score to settle. The real fighting was about to begin, the Crusaders' journey through Asia Minor. The Crusader armies made a fatal mistake. They split up. After Nicaea, Bohemond and Robert of Normandy led one force, while Godfrey and Raymond commanded another, each taking different routes through the sun-blasted Anatolian plateau. The terrain itself became an enemy, a seemingly endless expanse of brown hills and hidden valleys where every water source could conceal an ambush. This was perfect country for the Turks, who had mastered the art of turning landscape into a weapon. Kilij Arslan struck at dawn on July 1st, 1097. The valley of Dorylaeum erupted with the thunder of hooves as thousands of Turkish horse archers emerged from the morning mist. They had caught Bohemond's columns strung out and vulnerable. The nimble Turkish cavalry swooped in like falcons, loosing arrows that punched through mail armor at close range, then wheeling away before the Crusader knights could respond. European horses, bred for power rather than speed and weighted down with armored riders, couldn't catch the lighter Turkish mounts. It was a masterclass in steppe warfare. But Bohemund proved why he was considered the Crusades' finest tactical mind. Instead of charging futilely after the Turkish raiders, he ordered his knights to dismount and form a defensive circle around the army's women, children, and supplies. Hour after hour, they held their ground under the burning sun as arrows blackened the sky. Crusader crossbowmen gave better than they got, their powerful bolts punching through Turkish armor at ranges that shocked the enemy. Still, it seemed only a matter of time before ammunition ran out and the circle broke. Then, at the moment of crisis, Godfrey's army appeared on the ridgeline like an answered prayer. The Turks found themselves caught between two Crusader forces. What followed was pure slaughter. Heavy knights crashed into the Turkish rear, while Bohemund's men surged forward, finally unleashing the charge they'd been restraining all day. The Turks' light armor, so perfect for their mobile tactics, proved fatal in close combat. Their army shattered. The Sultan fled, leaving his treasure camp to the Crusaders. Among the spoils was his own war tent, which Bohemund claimed as a trophy, though he couldn't know he would soon need it for an even more audacious deception at Antioch. In the battle's aftermath, an unexpected figure emerged as crucial to the Crusaders' survival: Tatikios, the hook-nosed Byzantine general assigned as imperial liaison. His knowledge of the terrain and local population proved invaluable as the armies pushed inland. More importantly, his Turkish-style light cavalry provided the Crusaders with their own mobile screen against raids. The partnership between Latin knights and Byzantine scouts became a template for future Crusader warfare, though like so much else in this campaign, it wouldn't last. The armies now entered the most grueling phase of their journey. August in central Anatolia was hell for Europeans unused to such heat. Knights collapsed in their armor. Horses died by the hundreds. The Turks had poisoned wells and burned crops along the likely invasion routes. Water became more precious than gold. When the army finally reached the Taurus Mountains, men wept at the sight of snow on distant peaks. They had crossed one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, losing perhaps a third of their strength to heat, disease, and constant skirmishing. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's shrewd brother, was the first to spot opportunity in disaster. Breaking away from the main army with a small force, he followed tales of an Armenian Christian city that sought protection from Turkish raids. That city was Edessa, and Baldwin's decision to investigate would lead to the creation of the First Crusader state, though it would also deprive the main army of some of its best troops just before they faced their greatest challenge. The crusade had survived its march through hell only to arrive at the gates of Antioch, where an even worse ordeal awaited. Antioch, a tale of glory and betrayal. October 1097. The Crusaders' first sight of Antioch stole their breath away. Here was no mere fortress, but one of the great cities of the East, its massive walls studded with 400 towers that seemed to touch the clouds. The Roman-built fortifications had defeated every attacker for centuries. Now, as autumn rains turned the surrounding plains to mud, the Crusaders realized they faced something worse than Turkish arrows. They faced mathematics. Their army of perhaps 25,000 was trying to besiege a city of 400,000. The numbers were impossible. Antioch's walls presented an even more maddening problem. Too thick to batter down, too high to scale, they zigzagged up impossible slopes and across ravines. The city's eastern side perched on mountains, while its western flank was protected by the Orontes River. Only the northern and southern approaches offered any hope for assault, and those were guarded by walls 50 feet high and 15 feet thick. Worse, the defenders were not demoralized Turks, but hardened professionals led by Yagi Sian, a commander whose name had become a byword for cunning. The siege quickly turned into a nightmare of reversed fortunes. The supposedly besieged city remained well supplied through ports and mountain passes the Crusaders couldn't block. Meanwhile, the attackers began to starve. Winter storms rotted their tents. Horses died by the thousands, forcing proud knights to eat their own mounts. Byzantine supply ships provided barely enough to prevent complete collapse. As Christmas approached, the Crusader camp resembled a vast open-air hospital where skeletal figures huddled around fires, boiling leather shields for soup. Bohemond alone seemed to thrive amid the misery. The Norman prince had discovered that one of Antioch's towers was guarded by an Armenian Christian named Feuds, who nursed a grudge against Yagi-Sian. Secret messages passed back and forth. Promises were made. While other leaders debated tactics, Bohemond prepared for treachery. His price for sharing the plan: sole possession of Antioch once it fell. The other leaders, pushed to desperation by news of an approaching relief army, reluctantly agreed. On the moonless night of June 2nd, 1098, history turned on a rope ladder. Feuds signaled the hour with a lantern. 60 hand-picked knights climbed silently up the Tower of Two Sisters. The betrayal worked perfectly, too perfectly. By dawn, the Crusaders controlled most of Antioch's walls, and the streets ran red with blood. Yagi-Sian fled, but was beheaded by Armenian woodcutters. His head, presented to the Crusader leaders, became a grim trophy of victory. Then disaster struck. Kerboga, Mosul's mighty Atabeg, arrived with an army that made the hills disappear beneath a sea of steel. The Crusaders found themselves trapped inside Antioch, their brief triumph turned to ashes. Food ran out completely. Men who had survived months of siege now faced starvation behind the very walls they had fought so hard to breach. Desertion became epidemic. Even Stephen of Blois, who had seemed unshakable, fled to Constantinople with news that the crusade was doomed. In this darkest hour, the mysterious Holy Lance emerged. A Provençal peasant claimed visions led him to dig beneath the city's great church, where workers discovered what appeared to be the spear that pierced Christ's side. Skeptics noted that the discovery came suspiciously close to total collapse of morale, but its effect was electric. These were men who had marched thousands of miles on faith alone. The lance transformed their desperation into divine purpose. On June 28th, the Crusaders burst from Antioch's gates in what amounted to mass suicide, except they won. Kerboga's mighty army, divided by political rivalries and unnerved by the Crusaders' inexplicable confidence, broke and ran. The impossible victory convinced many that God had indeed blessed their cause. They had no way of knowing that the Islamic world's internal politics had helped them as much as any miracle. The road to Jerusalem now lay open, though the Crusaders' greatest test still awaited. The Holy City would demand a price in blood that would shock even men who thought they had seen everything. Jerusalem, prize of ages. Dawn, June 7th, 1099. The Crusaders crested the final hill and fell to their knees, weeping. Jerusalem lay before them, its golden walls shimmering in the morning light. After 3 years of marching, after 3,000 miles of blood and sacrifice, they had reached their sacred goal. These hardened warriors, who had eaten their horses during the winter at Antioch, who had watched 2/3 of their original army die, sobbed like children at their first glimpse of the holy city. The elation lasted precisely as long as it took to survey the tactical situation. Jerusalem's Egyptian Fatimid defenders had stripped the surrounding countryside bare. Every tree, every scrap of wood that could be used for siege engines had been dragged inside the walls. The Crusaders faced a nightmare. They had to take an immensely strong fortress in the middle of summer with no siege equipment and dwindling supplies. The surrounding hills offered no natural springs. The nearest source of timber lay 50 miles away through enemy territory. Fatimid governor Al-Afdal had prepared his defenses brilliantly. The garrison numbered well over 20,000 professional soldiers. The walls had been reinforced, the towers restocked with supplies that could last months. Most crucially, he had poisoned or blocked all wells within miles of the city. The Crusaders, now numbering less than 12,000 fighting men, would have to battle both the defenders and the scorching July heat. But desperation bred innovation. When Genoese ships arrived at Jaffa with crucial supplies, the Crusaders stripped their timbers to build siege towers. Local Christians revealed the existence of hidden caves containing beams from an abandoned monastery. Most critically, Tancred discovered a previously unknown cache of timber in Solomon's stables. Working in the brutal heat, the Crusaders constructed 2 massive siege towers, even as their water supplies dwindled to critical levels. The first assault failed catastrophically. The Fatimid defenders used Greek fire, a terrifying incendiary weapon that water couldn't quench, to burn down one siege tower. The other became stuck in the dry moat. Dozens of knights died trying to plant scaling ladders against walls swept by arrows and burning oil. The Crusaders fell back in disarray, their confidence shattered. Then arrived the mysterious priest Peter Desiderius with a message. The army must fast for 3 days, then march barefoot around Jerusalem's walls in imitation of biblical Joshua. To modernize, it seems like desperate superstition. But for men who had marched across continents on faith alone, it provided something essential: a plan. The resulting procession, thousands of warriors walking barefoot around the holy city while Muslims mockingly paraded crosses on the walls, captured everything surreal about this holy war. The final assault began at dawn on July 15th. 2 siege towers rolled forward under a storm of arrows. The northern tower, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, crept toward the walls while teams of men frantically filled the moat with anything they could find. On the southern side, Raymond of Toulouse's tower advanced through a hail of Greek fire. The desperate defenders hurled not just arrows but beehives and chunks of masonry. Around noon, something extraordinary happened. Later chronicles claim a mysterious knight appeared on the Mount of Olives, waving a gleaming shield that signaled the Crusaders to attack. What's certain is that Godfrey's tower finally reached the walls. A makeshift bridge slammed down. The first knights charged across into a hurricane of arrows. Among them were 2 Flemish knights, Leto and Gilbert of Tournai, who would forever claim the honor of being first into Jerusalem. The defenses cracked, then shattered. The Crusaders poured into the holy city in an unstoppable tide. What followed was one of history's most shocking massacres, shocking not in scale, but in the religious ecstasy that accompanied it. Hardened warriors who had spent years fighting wept openly as they walked blood-stained streets toward the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Raymond of Aguilers, an eyewitness, wrote that the streets ran ankle-deep in blood. Modern historians doubt this detail, but what's undeniable is the Crusaders' conviction that they were carrying out divine judgment. By nightfall on July 15th, Jerusalem had fallen. The First Crusade had achieved its supposedly impossible goal. But victory brought new questions. Who would rule the conquered city? How could a few thousand European warriors hope to hold territory surrounded by millions of hostile Muslims? The Crusaders had won their prize, but keeping it would prove even harder than taking it. The real story of the Crusader kingdoms was about to begin. Building a Latin East, the Crusaders' quest. 8 days after Jerusalem's conquest, the surviving Crusader leaders gathered in the blood-stained Holy Sepulchre to make an unprecedented decision: who would rule the city they had won. The obvious choice, Raymond of Toulouse, refused the crown. He would not wear gold where Christ had worn thorns. Instead, the mantle fell to Godfrey of Bouillon, who accepted with a political masterstroke. He took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king, threading the needle between practical power and pious humility. The challenges facing this new state were staggering. The Crusaders controlled little more than a string of coastal cities and the road to Jerusalem. Muslim forces still held powerful fortresses throughout the interior. The countryside remained largely hostile, populated by Muslims and Eastern Christians who had suffered heavily during the conquest. Most crucially, the Crusaders were now outnumbered perhaps 100 to 1 in a land where they didn't speak the language, understand the customs, or know how to farm the alien soil. Yet from this seemingly impossible position, the Crusaders began building something unprecedented: a European feudal society transplanted into the heart of the Islamic world. They did it through a remarkable combination of pragmatism and adaptation. Muslim farmers were allowed to keep working their lands. Local Christian communities were integrated into the new power structure. Arabic-speaking officials from the previous regime were retained to handle day-to-day administration. The result was a hybrid civilization unlike anything seen before. The transformation of Crusader castles tells the story. The first fortresses were built in pure European style, thick walls, square towers, designed to resist battering rams and siege engines. But these proved death traps in the desert heat. Local architects taught the Crusaders how to build for the climate, sloping walls that deflected the sun, water collection systems that could sustain years of siege, arrow slits positioned to catch cooling breezes. Crac de Chevalier, greatest of all Crusader castles, merged European military architecture with Eastern engineering to create something new and formidable. In the cities, an even more dramatic fusion emerged. Crusader women adopted Eastern fashions and cooking styles. Their children grew up speaking Arabic alongside French. Markets sold spices from India alongside wines from France. Churches rose next to mosques, while Eastern Christians acted as vital intermediaries between the ruling Franks and their Muslim subjects. The ports became history's first truly international cities, where Italian merchants haggled with Egyptian traders, while Georgian pilgrims mingled with Ethiopian monks. Yet this new society remained fundamentally precarious. The Crusader states suffered from chronic manpower shortages that no amount of immigration could solve. They depended heavily on the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, whose fortress monasteries formed a defensive backbone. But even these warrior monks couldn't be everywhere at once. The countryside remained dangerous, plagued by Bedouin raids and the constant threat of major Muslim attacks. Godfrey died just 1 year after taking power, replaced by his more pragmatic brother Baldwin Murbotsa, the man who had carved out Edessa. Baldwin abandoned his brother's pious hesitation and officially crowned himself king, establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a true medieval state. Under his rule, the Crusader territories expanded dramatically. Acre, Beirut, and Sidon fell to combined attacks from Crusader armies and Italian naval forces. Trade began to flourish. For a brief moment, it seemed the impossible dream of a Latin East might actually succeed. But time was not on the Crusaders' side. Every passing year saw Muslim powers slowly recovering from their internal divisions. Every victory stretched Crusader resources thinner. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a magnificent achievement that would leave an indelible mark on both European and Islamic civilization. But it was built on foundations of sand. The real question was not if it would fall, but when and what would emerge from its eventual collapse. Warriors of faith and fortune. In 1119, a French knight named Hugh of Paynes approached King Baldwin II with an audacious proposal. He and 8 companions would dedicate themselves to protecting pilgrims on the dangerous road to Jerusalem. The king granted them quarters in what he believed was Solomon's temple, and from this humble beginning sprang one of history's most extraordinary institutions, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. The early Templars lived in genuine poverty, so destitute that their seals showed 2 knights sharing a single horse. But Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his age, saw their potential. His treatise, in praise of the new knighthood, transformed their image overnight. Here was something revolutionary: warrior monks who could fight without sin, kill without guilt, and serve God with the sword. The concept electrified medieval Europe. Money and recruits poured in. European nobles donated vast estates. Second and third sons of aristocratic families pledged their swords. Within decades, the Templars evolved from 9 poor knights into medieval Europe's first multinational corporation. They developed sophisticated banking networks that could transfer money from London to Jerusalem. Kings deposited their treasuries with them. The Templar rule, their code of conduct, became a masterpiece of organizational management that companies still study today. The Hospitallers followed a different path to power. Originally founded to care for sick pilgrims, they added a military wing to match the Templars' success. But they never abandoned their medical mission. Hospitaller castles were also hospitals, where Islamic and European medical knowledge combined to create the medieval world's most sophisticated healthcare system. Their fortress in Crac des Chevaliers could house 2,000 patients alongside its garrison. Both orders developed fighting techniques uniquely suited to crusader warfare. Their heavy cavalry charged in tight formation, each rider protected by the shields of his brothers. Their sergeants, professional soldiers who weren't noble knights, provided crucial infantry support. Most importantly, they didn't retreat. Regular crusader armies might withdraw if the odds were bad, but the military orders fought to the death. The mere sight of their distinctive mantles, white with a red cross for Templars, black with a white cross for Hospitallers, could change the course of battles. The order's power grew until they answered only to the Pope, not to kings or nobles. They developed their own diplomatic networks, gathering intelligence from both Christian and Muslim sources. Their fortresses became states within states, controlling vital trade routes and agricultural lands. They were bankers, diplomats, warriors, and spy masters all at once, the medieval equivalent of combining the Navy SEALs with Goldman Sachs. But success bred resentment. European nobles envied their wealth and independence. Muslims feared their military prowess. Kings distrusted their divided loyalties. The Templars' eventual destruction by Philip IV of France, achieved through torture, false confessions, and papal complicity, revealed both their strength and fatal weakness. They had become too powerful to control, yet remained vulnerable to the very political forces they tried to transcend. Yet the military order's greatest impact wasn't military or financial, it was cultural. They were the first Europeans to systematically study and adapt Islamic military techniques, medical knowledge, and architectural innovations. Their castles combined European and Arab defensive principles. Their hospitals used Islamic medical texts alongside Greek and Latin ones. They demonstrated that East and West could learn from each other, even while fighting. The Hospitallers survived as the Knights of Malta, defending Europe from Ottoman expansion for centuries. Their legacy lived on in every military order that followed, from the Teutonic Knights to the modern sovereign military order of Malta. The military orders represented something unique in medieval history. Institutions that combined religious devotion, military power, and sophisticated financial operations. They were multinational, multicultural, and centuries ahead of their time. Their rise and fall charts the course of the Crusader states themselves, from humble beginnings through spectacular success to eventual doom, leaving behind a complex legacy that shaped both East and West. The Muslim revival and its strategic transformation. In 1127, a hard-faced Turkish warrior named Zengi seized control of Mosul. The Crusaders barely noticed. They had survived dozens of ambitious Muslim warlords before. But Zengi was different. Where others saw only personal glory, he saw strategy. Where rivals fought each other, he built alliances. Most crucially, he recognized the Crusader state's greatest weakness. They could not replace their losses. Zengi's genius lay in patience. For 17 years, he gathered strength while the Crusaders grew weaker. He built an intelligence network that reached into every Crusader castle. He modernized his army, combining Turkish horse archers with professional Syrian infantry. He studied Crusader tactics, learning how to neutralize their devastating heavy cavalry charges. When he finally struck in 1144, his target was perfect: Edessa, the most isolated Crusader state. The fall of Edessa shattered Christian confidence. Here was the first Crusader capital to return to Muslim hands. The city's capture was accompanied by a massacre that showed Zengi's calculated brutality. He was building a reputation that would make future cities surrender rather than face his wrath. More importantly, he had proven that the Crusader states could be beaten. But Zengi's assassination in 1146 seemed to halt the Muslim revival. His death sparked exactly the kind of succession crisis that had allowed the Crusaders to succeed in the first place. Yet this time, something different happened. Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, proved even more formidable than his father. Where Zengi had been a brilliant warrior, Nur ad-Din was a visionary. He didn't just want to defeat the Crusaders, he wanted to transform the Muslim world. Nur ad-Din's greatest innovation was ideology. He popularized the concept of jihad not just as holy war, but as a tool for Muslim unity. He built madrasas, religious schools, and hospitals, patronized scholars and poets. His propaganda portrayed the Crusaders not as invincible warriors, but as vulnerable invaders. Most crucially, he presented himself not as a Turkish warlord, but as a champion of all Muslims, whether Arab, Kurd, or Turk. The Second Crusade's catastrophic failure in 1148 proved Nur ad-Din's approach was working. The greatest armies Europe could muster were destroyed not by a single battle, but by a campaign of exhaustion. Muslim forces refused pitched battles, instead harassing the Crusaders at every step, poisoning wells and striking at weak points. When Damascus, which the Crusaders had counted as an ally, sided with Nur ad-Din, it marked a diplomatic revolution. The Muslim world was choosing unity over division. The final piece of Nur ad-Din's grand strategy fell into place in Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate was collapsing, creating a power vacuum that both Crusaders and Muslims rushed to fill. Nur ad-Din's intervention proved decisive. He sent his most capable general, Shirkuh, accompanied by Shirkuh's young nephew, Salah ad-Din, known to Europe as Saladin. The young Saladin watched and learned as his uncle maneuvered between Egyptians, Crusaders, and his own nominal master Nur ad-Din. When Shirkuh died in 1169, Saladin inherited command at age 31. His rise to power was meteoric. Within months, he had made himself vizier of Egypt. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin was perfectly positioned to seize control of his empire. Yet Saladin was no mere opportunist. He had absorbed the lessons of both Zengi and Nur ad-Din. From one he learned strategic patience, from the other the power of ideology. He would combine these with his own gifts, military genius, political acumen, and a personal charisma that would make him legendary among both friends and enemies. The stage was set for the Muslim world's greatest champion to face the Crusaders' greatest warriors in a conflict that would determine the fate of the Holy Land. The Muslim revival had transformed random resistance into systematic reconquest. The Crusader states now faced a united enemy, led by men who understood both their strengths and weaknesses. The coming storm would test whether Latin Jerusalem could survive against the full might of a resurgent Islamic world. Saladin's strategic unification and empire building. History turns on improbable moments. In 1171, Saladin stood in Cairo's Great Mosque as the muezzin's call to prayer rang out. For the first time in 2 centuries, the call honored not the Fatimid Caliph, but the Sunni Caliph in Baghdad. The revolution Saladin had engineered was bloodless, stylish, and absolute. Egypt's immense wealth and resources now lay in his hands. He was 33 years old. What followed was a masterclass in empire building. While his predecessors had ruled through force, Saladin governed through a web of loyalty and calculated generosity. He abolished oppressive taxes, built schools and hospitals, and patronized scholars and poets. His personal physician was a Jew, his chief administrator a Coptic Christian. He demonstrated that tolerance could be a weapon as effective as any sword. Yet beneath the cultured surface lay steel. When a group of Egyptian officers plotted against him, Saladin's response was swift and merciless. The plotters were crucified along Cairo's main thoroughfare. The message was clear: cross the new master at your peril. But unlike previous rulers, Saladin followed punishment with reconciliation. He incorporated the plotters' families into his own administration, turning potential enemies into loyal supporters. His military innovations were equally dramatic. He created a professional army that combined the best elements of Egyptian, Syrian, and Turkish warfare. His Mamluks, elite slave soldiers, were trained from childhood in sophisticated cavalry tactics. He revolutionized siege warfare, developing specialized units of engineers and pioneering the use of counterweight trebuchets. Most importantly, he built a logistics system that could support massive armies in the field for months at a time. The Crusaders watched Saladin's rise with growing alarm. In 1177, they attempted to cut him down before he grew too powerful. The resulting Battle of Montgisard should have been Saladin's end. His army was caught in the rain by a smaller Crusader force, led by the teenage king Baldwin IV, who, despite suffering from leprosy, proved himself a brilliant commander. The Muslim army was slaughtered. Saladin himself barely escaped with his personal guard. But defeat taught Saladin more than victory ever could. He studied how the Crusaders had trapped him, how their heavy cavalry had shattered his lines, how their infantry had exploited the wet conditions that bogged down his horse archers. He would never make the same mistakes again. Each subsequent campaign showed greater sophistication. He learned to fight in all seasons, to coordinate multiple armies across vast distances, to wage psychological warfare through calculated shows of mercy or cruelty. By 1186, Saladin had assembled the largest army the Muslim world had seen since the days of the Prophet. His domain stretched from the Libyan desert to the mountains of Armenia, from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. He had united Egypt and Syria, ended the Sunni-Shia divide, and created an administration that could effectively govern this vast territory. The Crusader kingdoms were now surrounded by a single, efficient empire commanded by a military genius. Yet, Saladin's greatest weapon wasn't his army, it was patience. He waited for the Crusaders to make a fatal mistake, knowing that their precarious position and chronic manpower shortages meant they eventually would. When Guy of Lusignan became king of Jerusalem, that mistake finally came. Rather than maintain the careful balance of power that had kept the Crusader states alive, Guy chose aggression. He allied himself with Raynald of Chatillon, a man whose raids on Muslim caravans and pilgrims had given Saladin the perfect casus belli. The trap was set. All Saladin had to do was wait for his enemies to walk into it. The decisive battle would come at a place called Hattin, where 2 decades of preparation would finally bear fruit. The Muslim revival was about to become a Muslim triumph, and the Crusader states would face their greatest test of survival. The Third Crusade, Kings and Killers. When news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe in 1187, 3 kings took the cross. Each represented a different face of medieval power. Richard of England, the warrior king who had been fighting since childhood. Philip Augustus of France, the spider king who preferred schemes to battles. And Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, the legendary Red Beard who had ruled for nearly 40 years and commanded Europe's largest army. Richard was a force of nature. 6 feet 4 inches tall, with the strength to wield weapons most men could barely lift, he had been crushing rebellions since age 16. His military innovations transformed medieval warfare. He pioneered the use of crossbow artillery and developed sophisticated siege techniques. But his greatest weapon was personal charisma. Men would follow him into hell itself, and frequently did. Yet Richard's brilliance came with fatal flaws. He was chronically impatient, politically tone-deaf, and prone to sudden rages. He had spent barely 6 months of his adult life in England, preferring to fight in France. To fund his crusade, he famously declared he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. He emptied England's treasury, sold offices and titles, and still needed more. "I would sell my own father if I could find someone to buy him," he joked, though few thought he was entirely joking. Philip Augustus presented a stark contrast. Where Richard was a warrior, Philip was a calculator. He had ascended France's throne at age 15, facing powerful nobles who openly mocked him. By 25, he had outmaneuvered them all. His real goal wasn't Jerusalem, but Richard's French territories. The crusade was merely a chess move in their longer game. He took the cross primarily because he couldn't afford to let Richard go alone. The most tragic figure was Frederick Barbarossa. At 67, he was ancient by medieval standards, yet still commanded awe. His German army was the largest and best equipped force to leave Europe since the First Crusade. More importantly, he had actually fought in the east before. He understood the logistics, the terrain, and the tactics needed. If anyone could have retaken Jerusalem, it was Frederick. Behind these kings came a cast of characters whose actions would shape history. Conrad of Montferrat, the Italian mercenary who saved Byzantium from disaster, only to find greater challenges in Outremer. Leopold of Austria, proud and prickly, whose wounded honor would eventually lead to Richard's downfall. And the mysterious Old Man of the Mountain, master of the assassins, whose hidden daggers made him a power broker even kings had to respect. The king's preparations transformed Europe. Forests were cleared to build ships. Jewish communities were ransacked for funding. Special Saladin taxes were levied on anyone who didn't take the cross. Markets were flooded with land and titles as nobles liquidated everything to buy equipment. The scale of mobilization hadn't been seen since the First Crusade, but this time the armies were professional. They took different routes. Frederick led his Germans overland through Byzantine territory, following the old Crusader road. Philip and Richard went by sea, their fleets representing the cutting edge of medieval naval technology. Each choice carried its own dangers. The land route was faster, but vulnerable to Turkish attacks. The sea route was safer, but at the mercy of Mediterranean weather. Yet before any of them reached the Holy Land, the campaign's nature changed dramatically. Frederick Barbarossa, the one leader with the experience and resources to potentially retake Jerusalem, drowned crossing a river in Asia Minor. His death shattered the German army. Some pressed on, but most turned back, carrying their emperor's pickled remains home in a barrel of vinegar. The Third Crusade would now be a duel between Richard and Saladin, with Philip playing a dangerous game between them. The stage was set for the most famous confrontation of the entire crusading era, a conflict that would generate legends retold for centuries. The fate of Jerusalem hung in the balance, but so did something larger, the future shape of both East and West. The Third Crusade, a clash of civilizations. The Siege of Acre became the Crusades' crucible. For 2 years, the greatest armies of two civilizations clashed beneath its walls in what amounted to 2 simultaneous sieges, Christians besieging Muslims inside the city, while Saladin's armies besieged the Christian camp from behind. Disease killed more than combat. The ditches filled with corpses. Kings and peasants alike succumbed to dysentery. The very ground became toxic. Medieval descriptions of the acre sickness suggest the soil itself had become a breeding ground for pathogens. Richard arrived like a thunderbolt in June 1191. Within days, he transformed the siege. Despite burning with fever, the first touch of an illness that would plague him throughout the campaign, he personally directed the construction of massive siege engines. His innovation of using crossbow covering fire to protect sappers working beneath the walls changed medieval siege warfare forever. When Philip Augustus sulked in his tent with illness, Richard had himself carried to the front lines on a silk stretcher, directing attacks while barely able to stand. Acre fell in July, but the victory turned bitter. Negotiations over prisoner exchanges collapsed in mutual suspicion. Richard, impatient to march south and convinced Saladin was stalling, ordered 2,700 Muslim prisoners executed in full view of Saladin's army. The mass killing shocked both sides and cast a shadow over all future negotiations. It was Richard's first major political mistake in a campaign that would be marked by brilliant tactical success and strategic failure. The coastal march south became legend. Saladin's armies harassed the Crusader column constantly, forcing Richard to develop new tactics. He created a mobile fortress of men, crossbowmen and spearmen protecting the flanks, while knights waited in the center, ready to launch devastating countercharges. At Arsuf, Saladin finally managed to provoke a full battle. The result was a masterclass in medieval combat. Richard held his knights in check despite hours of provocations, waiting until the perfect moment to unleash a charge that shattered Saladin's army. But tactical victories couldn't solve strategic problems. Philip Augustus abandoned the crusade after Acre, taking many French troops with him. Richard tried to compensate through local alliances, supporting Guy of Lusignan's claim to the throne of Jerusalem against Conrad of Montferrat. The political maneuvering backfired spectacularly when Conrad was assassinated. Some blamed Richard, others blamed the assassins, but the death drove a permanent wedge between Richard and the local nobility. The campaign's high point came during the winter of 1191–92. Richard pushed inland, actually reaching sight of Jerusalem. His advance guard could see the holy city's walls. But the closer they got to Jerusalem, the more obvious their logistical problems became. They could probably take the city. Richard's siege techniques had improved with each conquest. But they couldn't hold it. Without control of the surrounding countryside, any garrison would be isolated and doomed. The campaign then devolved into a strange dance. Richard and Saladin tested each other through raids and skirmishes while their diplomats negotiated increasingly complex deals. Both leaders recognized they faced a stalemate. Richard couldn't take and hold Jerusalem with his remaining forces. Saladin couldn't risk another major battle after his army's morale was shaken at Arsuf. The solution they eventually hammered out was a masterpiece of medieval pragmatism. A 3-year truce that left the coast in Christian hands while Jerusalem remained Muslim, with guarantees for pilgrim access to the holy sites. Neither side was truly satisfied, but both could claim victory. Saladin had kept Jerusalem. Richard had saved the Crusader kingdom from total destruction and secured a stable coastal base. The Treaty of Jaffa might have led to a lasting peace, but both leaders died soon after: Richard from an infected arrow wound received in France, Saladin from a fever in Damascus. The Third Crusade marked both the high point and the beginning of the end for the crusading movement. It demonstrated that even Europe's greatest warriors, led by its most capable king, couldn't recapture Jerusalem. Future crusades would be increasingly desperate affairs, marked by political schemes rather than military achievement. The age of great conquests was over. The age of survival had begun. Legacy and consequences of the Crusades. The later Crusades read like tragic echoes of former glory. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. Instead, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, destroying the very empire that had first requested their help. The Children's Crusade of 1212 ended in slavery and death when thousands of young people, convinced that their innocence would succeed where armies had failed, were betrayed by merchants who sold them in North African slave markets. Frederick II briefly reclaimed Jerusalem in 1229 through diplomacy rather than combat, walking into the holy city wearing a crown while Muslim calls to prayer still echoed from its minarets. The achievement lasted barely 15 years. The final fall of Jerusalem in 1244 was almost anticlimactic, the city changing hands as larger empires clashed around it. Louis IX of France, St. Louis, led the last 2 major crusades. The first ended with him ransomed from Egyptian captivity, the second with his death from dysentery on the North African coast. By then, the crusading movement had lost its focus on Jerusalem. Campaigns were launched against pagans in the Baltic, heretics in France, and political enemies of the papacy. The word crusade itself became devalued, applied to any papal-blessed military adventure. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the official end of the Crusader kingdoms. The last defenders, Templars, and Hospitallers fighting alongside desperate civilians were driven into the sea. The Templars would be destroyed by their own success, their wealth and independence provoking French King Philip IV to orchestrate their downfall. The Hospitallers survived by retreating to Rhodes and later Malta, evolving into a naval power that would battle Ottoman expansion for centuries. Yet the Crusades' real legacy lay not in territories won or lost, but in how they transformed both civilizations they touched. Banking, diplomacy, architecture, medicine, and military technology all evolved through this violent cultural exchange. European castle design incorporated Muslim defensive innovations. Islamic armies adopted European heavy cavalry tactics. Trade routes established during the Crusades continued to shape economics long after the fighting ended. The impact on imagination proved even more lasting. Europeans gained new foods, textiles, and technologies. Words entered European languages: admiral from amir, magazine from makazine. Muslim scholars preserved and expanded on Greek learning that would help spark Europe's Renaissance. The whole concept of chivalry, that peculiar medieval fusion of warfare, religion, and romance, emerged from crusader culture where enemies could admire each other across battle lines. More darkly, the Crusades created lasting patterns of cultural conflict and prejudice. They established a European military presence in the Middle East that would echo through centuries of colonialism. They spawned religious intolerance that still haunts interfaith relations. The very word crusade remains contentious, carrying different meanings for different peoples. Yet perhaps the Crusades' greatest lesson lies in what they reveal about human nature. They show how faith can inspire both the noblest and basest actions, how cultural contact leads to both conflict and synthesis, how the same events can be viewed as holy war or imperial aggression depending on perspective. They remind us that people rarely fit neat categories of hero or villain. Saladin could be brutally pragmatic, Richard capable of surprising mercy, and both could admire each other while trying to destroy each other's armies. The physical traces of the Crusades still dot the landscape: massive castles, forgotten churches, ruins of once great ports. But their real monument lies in how they shaped the modern world, in banking systems that evolved from crusader money transfers, in diplomatic protocols that emerged from necessity, in architectural features we still use, in words we speak without knowing their origin. The Crusades ended centuries ago, yet we live daily with their inheritance, for good and ill. When Urban Decaux called the First Crusade, he unleashed forces beyond anyone's control or comprehension. He thought he was launching a limited expedition to help Eastern Christians. Instead, he sparked 2 centuries of warfare that would reshape 3 civilizations and echo through a millennium. The Crusades remind us that history's greatest events often spring from unintended consequences, that cultural contact is inevitably transformative, and that the past is never truly past. It lives on in ways we are still discovering.